Hello, dear listener. If you exist out there in the void, I am your friendly neighborhood rambler, and I'm here with quite the variety of subjects today. First, I'm going to have some good old lighthearted fun slandering some popular YA tropes, or at least ones I encountered a lot back when I was super into YA. Then I'm going to give my commentary on the economic situation in early medieval Europe, and finally we'll circle back around to the world of YA so I can speculate a bit on the direction that the Shadow and Bone TV series is taking with its characterization. I'll provide timestamps below so you may skip around these segments as you please. Without further ado, let the rambling commence. I woke up this morning and chose violence against young adult fiction. I am not sorry. I used to read an unhealthy amount of YA fantasy in particular, and so I have seen everything on this list way too many times. Is it possible this overexposure has affected my feelings on it? Yes. Does that make me willing to offer some leniency? No. This is, of course, entirely personal preference, which means maybe you really love some of these things, and honestly, more power to you. Have fun reading what you want, and I shall steer far clear. Maybe I'm just not the target audience, and that's perfectly fine and dandy. I'm also hardly the first or last person to criticize some of these, so I won't pretend to be offering super radical opinions. This is just what I think as a reader. Anyways, now that the disclaimer is out of the way, I will now be presenting my top 5 least favorite YA tropes in absolutely no particular order. At number 1, we have enemies to lovers. Starting off strong here with probably my biggest hot take on the list, as I know it's been incredibly popular in recent YA trends, especially in the world of book talk. Honestly, I don't even hate it in general, and I've read it done well before. I think I've just seen the same sad, tired story over and over again so many times that I'm just incredibly sick of it. That said, I do have nitpicks with several variations on the trope, mostly in cases where the characters don't necessarily have a reason to be enemies or rivals, and instead of exploring their motivations to be against each other, it just ends up with the characters being jerks to each other for seemingly no reason. I also find that in enemies to lovers relationships where it's a guy and a girl, it's almost always the guy who's just a little bit worse to the girl, or the guy who's evil while the girl is good, and I would love to see maybe a tiny bit of variation there at the very least. Also, I love me a redemption arc, but I dislike it immensely when it is only due to a romantic interest that the character chooses to become a better person or even completely join the good side. YA fantasies will have these actual straight-up war criminal tyrant types, but then be like, but wait, he's in love with the main character. Whoops, looks like he's a good person now. If someone is so easily swayed to abandon their entire prior motivation for a romantic interest, then it makes those prior motivations seem incredibly flimsy. I just find it hard to believe that an individual driven enough to do bad things to achieve their goals would suddenly decide to change in that way, and it kind of de-immerses me whenever it happens because it feels like the author thought of the romance first and the characters and broader plot second. There's nothing inherently wrong with that if it's your cup of tea, of course, but it's certainly not my cup of tea. Number 2, not like other girls. Guys, I really thought we were beyond this mentality by now. Enough people have spoken about this that I don't even feel like I have to elaborate much on my problems with it as a trope. There's nothing wrong with a female character not being into traditionally feminine things, just like there's nothing wrong with that in the real world, but problems arise when that overflows from simply personal choices to criticizing others just for being feminine. Let's not, please. I don't like to see it in the real world, and I certainly don't want to see it in my fiction either. Number 3. This one is kind of ultra-specific and definitely more of a personal pet peeve than anything else, but I've always been a bit surprised that not more people are talking about it. It's that thing that dystopian books will do where they set up this plot of overthrowing the bad current government with their scrappy ragtag band of rebellious individuals, and then they do overthrow the government, and we just never see how things get fixed. I mean, I want to see the aftermath. I want to see how the power vacuum is addressed. I want all the juicy political drama and to see whether things do actually improve. Without that additional context, I always end up feeling dissatisfied with the ending, like they haven't really changed anything with their revolution. Number 4, teenagers. Let me clarify. I understand that the target audience of YA is in fact teenagers, and that to an extent it makes sense to write in a way that represents your audience. Again, this one isn't a problem with the writing at all, but just with my own preferences as a reader. I find that sometimes I'll be reading a YA, having a lovely time, totally imagining the characters as being at least mid-20s because it just makes more sense based on their circumstances or maturity level or what have you, and then I'll proceed to take a metaphorical slap to the face when I'm reminded they're all actually 16. I'm around that age, and I have very, very rarely seen my experiences reflected in the characters that are meant to be the same age as I am. Maybe because of this, having those characters be younger seems kind of gimmicky and like it's just restricting the plot as the authors have to do more gymnastics to explain why a bunch of hormonal kids have to save the world or whatever. This kind of ties into my dislike for the parents out of the picture trope, too. Finally, number 5. Everyone is gorgeous all the time. Now, don't get me wrong. I like pretty people as much as the next guy over, but seriously, no one is going to look hot after traveling several hundred miles on horseback, or slaying a dragon, or living in the woods alone. Also, YA has this weird thing about commenting on how people smell. Like the number of times I've seen something along the lines of, "She smelled faintly sweet, like cinnamon." Nothing wrong with wanting to smell nice, but nobody's going to be worried about that if you're participating in the Hunger Games or something, and it certainly won't just magically happen if you don't have access to proper hygiene and some sort of scent. I am tired of the reality TV-esque perfect hair and makeup in my books. We need some more average people representation over here. As a bonus mention, I'll add in here generic European fantasy settings. They don't instantly annoy me or anything, but it is something I feel could be changed overall. It seems to exist as the go-to for every basic fantasy, and there are just so many other routes to go that it shouldn't just be the default. But there you have it. Those are my top 5 least favorite YA tropes, or at least the top 5 I thought of while planning this episode. Will they stop me from reading the books they're in? Probably not. Will I occasionally cringe at them? Of course. But that's what reading YA is about, really. If you're a consumer of the genre, then you definitely know what I'm talking about. Sometimes we love to hate it and hate to love it, and that's perfectly okay. Hey listener, let's talk about currency in Europe after the fall of Rome, something I'm sure you've been wildly curious about. As I'm likely to remind you a multitude of times in the future, I am certainly not an expert on any of this, but merely a curious individual who has chosen to do some light research into the topic. If you find it interesting too, I'd advise you to look into it on your own time for a more thorough and accurate understanding, and definitely take all of this with a grain of salt. The economic situation of the Germanic peoples in the early Middle Ages, specifically the 5th to 7th centuries, was a major mess. Let me explain. You were probably taught about the Dark Ages in school, then subsequently taught that this is something of a misnomer, as it comes from a Eurocentric view of history that kinda ignores all the super cool advancements being made elsewhere. But it is undeniable that it certainly wasn't a great time to be living in most parts of Europe due to a few factors, though today I'm going to be specifically focusing on the economy bit. As many changes around the area in this time period, one could say it all began with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE. I'm actually going to turn away from the main topic for a sec to talk about the Eastern Roman Empire. It'll start making sense later, so stick with me. Even after the other half collapsed, the Eastern Roman guys, aka the Byzantine Empire, continued to go strong and actually became something of an economic powerhouse, not losing their claim to that title until solidly into the 13th century. The Byzantines used a system based around the gold solidus, which would become a widespread standard, with silver and bronze coins being added after reforms by Anastasius I, who reigned from 491 to 518 CE. All 3 of these metals were mainly minted in Constantinople. So, why is this relevant? Mostly because of the tensions between the Byzantine Empire in the east and the Germanic peoples in the west. See, due to their prior trade and interaction with the Romans on large, the Germanic peoples collectively had little issue with adopting the gold coin as a mode of exchange. Since, as we've established, the Byzantine Empire was a major player in the economical landscape, this would generally be a good idea. However, any friendly relations there didn't last very long. As with many large-scale conflicts during this time, the nature of interactions between these two groups can be traced back to having an origin in their varying religious beliefs when it came to Christianity. By the time period in question, many of the Germanic tribes had been converted to Arianism, the belief that Jesus was created by God, first deemed heretical by the Council of Nicaea in 325. This caused hostility between the Germanic peoples and the Byzantine Empire, which as a whole supported orthodoxy. Additionally, the Byzantine Empire still saw Germanic successors to Western Rome as, well, Romans, and wanted them brought back under their rule. Perhaps it was due to these reasons that the Germanic states grew increasingly separated in their individual currencies from the Byzantine standard. Although still borrowing heavily from the coinage of the Byzantine Empire and even earlier currencies of the Western Roman Empire, coinage among the Germanic peoples steadily separated from the usual imagery of the Byzantine emperor. A notable first example of breaking from the standard comes from Theobald I, a Frankish king who began to stamp gold coins with his own name. The ability to mint coins was also greatly expanded, and soon everyone everywhere was issuing their own distinct version. And if grouping the Germanic tribes together for the sake of this discussion has convinced you they were cooperative, I'll take a moment to clarify that that was definitely not the case. Fighting over land and goods and basically anything else two groups may come into conflict over was incredibly common, and honestly, it was kind of just a big mess for a while. There were also a lot of them, and they were constantly shifting with changes in leadership and geographical movement. But I'm getting a bit off track here. Back to money. If you've ever taken a world history class, I'm sure you've already learned way more about major early trade routes than you've cared to know. As a refresher, though, these trade routes were not only a way of exchanging goods, but also of transferring new technologies and ideas. So pretty nifty and also extremely integral to the development of civilizations. Until the 9th century, however, it is incredibly difficult to find evidence of the Germanic states being involved in much international trade, possibly due to the general disorganization or just their geographical location. The exchange of goods remained a largely local affair. Perhaps because of this small-scale trading, barter was simply a lot more practical than the coinage system, especially with so many different currencies in circulation. Aside from their interactions or lack thereof with other groups, there was also the issue of physically sourcing metal for creating the coins themselves. Mining on a whole became significantly less effective after the fall of Rome and was either done at very shallow depths or through the reopening of already abandoned Roman mines. It also seems like pretty much the only precious metal they really had consistent access to was iron, which makes their continued use of a coinage system revolving around gold, silver, and bronze seem like a kind of bad idea. The majority of gold supply at the time came from West Africa, but transporting metals was costly and, as stated previously, trade on a broad scale just wasn't really working out at the time. With basically everything stacked against their economic success, it's hardly surprising that there was such a long period of general stagnation in that part of the world after the fall of Rome. This is a highly limited snapshot of history, though, and things did eventually get way better. It just took a while. But let us now leave the realm of history to get back into the far preferable realm of fiction. Before I go any further, please note that the remainder of this episode will almost definitely contain major spoilers for the Grisha trilogy and Six of Crows duology by Leigh Bardugo, as well as spoilers for the first 2 seasons of the Shadow and Bone TV show based upon the aforementioned books. Also, if you're listening to this segment, I will be assuming that you have at least a basic knowledge of the plot, so if you don't, this may get somewhat confusing, and final disclaimer, I will be pronouncing things wrong. I know there's a pronunciation guide in the back of the books. I did not read that. Also, I read the books way before I ever saw the show, so I will be pronouncing the things like I pronounced them in my head when I was reading the books. Hopefully you understand that. In case you couldn't tell by the previous segment where I complained heartily about tropes of the genre, I was, and to an extent still am, a great consumer of young adult fiction, especially fantasy, so naturally I stumbled upon Leigh Bardugo's books early on in my YA reading career, and very quickly became very obsessed with them. Although in retrospect, I don't feel that the original series quite holds up, I still generally enjoy the books, and so when the TV show was announced, I of course couldn't pass up watching it. Though I will admit, thus far I've only seen the first season and like half of the second. I've been waiting to watch the rest of it with a friend of mine who's also a fan of the books. So, it's entirely possible that my concerns and speculation here is addressed in the latter half of the season, and I am just ignorant to such developments. Mostly, I think I'm just confused by the Crows' inclusion in the plot. Don't get me wrong, they're easily my favorite part of the show, but having read the books, I'm trying to figure out exactly where the show plans to go with their character arcs, specifically in terms of motivations. Although there have been significant changes to each of the Crows' stories from page to screen, the one I'm most curious about is definitely Cosbreaker himself. If you've read the books, you're definitely familiar with his grudge against Per Haskell over the death of his brother that serves as major motivation for him throughout both books, culminating in a confrontation at the end of the series where he basically chases Per Haskell out of Ketterdam, using his son as leverage. This was obviously kind of a huge plot point and an important part of Kaz's character arc, and its timing at the end of the series is pretty important as Per Haskell and his gang are major players throughout the books. But the thing is, this confrontation occurs beat for beat in the show, and it's way too early, happening before any of the events in Six of Crows have taken place. I think I understand why they did it. We don't see the Crows at all in the Grisha trilogy books, so there's not really much material to base their individual character developments off of that would be taking place during the time of Alina's story. Because of this, it makes sense that the show writers would find it necessary to move the order of events around in order to keep the characters from being stagnant and not really growing or changing at all. But this does have the side effect of putting them all at different parts of their arcs if/when the show reaches material covered in the Six of Crows books. It's difficult to see why exactly Kaz would have his reasons to take the actions he does in the books without that huge part of his motivation, and I'm not sure how they're planning to compensate for it. It's the same with the other Crows to an extent, but I think Kaz is definitely where the timeline changes are most extreme. Who knows, though, the plot of the show has already deviated from the plot of the books to the point that I wouldn't be surprised if they decided to go forward with the Crows after they've finished with the original trilogy and just end up axing the Ice Court plotline altogether. Or perhaps they'll add things to the characters' backstories, or change other external factors to give them proper motivations. Whatever they decide to do, I, for one, am looking forward to the continuation of the show and seeing where it goes, even if it does end up, as many adaptations, being entirely different from the source material. And there you have it. This first episode was definitely a little clunky, as I'm still finding my footing in terms of what exactly I want this podcast to be, so thank you for bearing with me. We'll have to see what the future holds in terms of new segments and what topics I'll be covering. At any rate, that's all for now, dear listener, but perchance our paths will cross once more out there in the void that is the internet. Thanks for listening.